Welcome to another episode of Marriage for Better, for Worse. Greetings, I'm Pastor Bob Moeller, your host for this 30 minutes or so. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the subject, the top 7 mistakes singles can make. The top 7 mistakes singles can make. We'll get to that in just a moment. Well, we want you to tune in to our YouTube channel as well, where you can find all of our past programs. It's go to YouTube and type in Marriage TV, and you'll find all the programs that we have recorded to date. Also want to invite you to consider purchasing our new book, The 6 Hearts of Intimacy. That's available, The 6 Hearts of Intimacy, at any major online book distributor. Why don't you consider purchasing that? It's our attempt to help strengthen people's love and passion, their physical life with one another, according to what Scripture says. Consider that if you would. Finally, remember that I'm not a professional counselor. I'm not a professional therapist or licensed individual. I am a pastor that believes listening, caring, prayer, and God's Word can resolve relationship issues. Let's look at this program's topic, the 7 mistakes, the top mistakes that singles can make. For some adult singles who feel disappointed, dissatisfied, or even angry with their marital status, there may be, I'm not saying it's always the case, but there may be some mistakes they are making, which, if corrected, could change their prospects of finding a lifelong mate. The first and most obvious mistake, I believe, is anger. None of us are naturally drawn to a person who displays constant hostility or even the more subtle forms of anger, such as passive aggression. Anger is actually usually the 3rd or 4th generation manifestation of a deep emotional hurt or wound. And rather than getting angry, we need to identify that wound, confess where it's led us into the sin of unrighteous anger, and let that wound be healed by the love of Christ. So anger is the first thing that will drive people away. Number 2, the second mistake is self-pity. Again, few of us are drawn to someone who is caught up in an attitude of victimhood, injustice, and self-pity. The unfairness of life is their constant theme. That person needs to replace their attitude of self-pity with one of biblical thankfulness and rejoicing of all that God has blessed them with. Or as one country singer once said, Charlie Daniels, of performing at a half-full auditorium, never count the empty seats. You know, that's really good advice. Rather than feeling sorry for yourself, counting the empty seats in your life, count the ones that are occupied with friends, relatives, other believers, individuals that do make your life rich, and be thankful for that. Third, the third mistake singles can make is an attitude of bitterness. This is closely akin to anger, but it is rooted in an unwillingness to forgive others or to accept the suffering that God may have permitted into your life. A bitterness can be just an unwillingness to forgive anyone who's hurt you or disappointed or betrayed you, or it can be an unwillingness to accept the difficulties God has allowed into your life. Doesn't mean He sent them, doesn't mean He's the author of them, but He has permitted them or they wouldn't be there. And accepting that and believing that God is at work in that situation is so important. Needless to say, the attitude of bitterness will off-put most people, particularly somebody that you're trying to attract. Bitterness needs to be replaced with an attitude of true forgiveness, true graciousness, and a willingness to trust God to make right the wrongs that have been committed against us in life. Bitterness can be defeated by the simple act of forgiveness, which is canceling someone else's moral debt, giving up the right to revenge, and replacing it instead with a spirit of grace and a spirit of mercy toward people. I believe that when we forgive someone, hard as it may be, we should finish the prayer by asking God to bless them. Now, we're not asking Him to bless their sinfulness and their wrong behavior, but what greater blessing could God bring into someone's life than to show them their sin and to show them how they are hurting people and to lead them to repentance? The fourth mistake singles can make is self-focus or pride. Self-focus is just what it says, focusing or concentrating on my hurts, my difficulties, possibly even my depression. So I have no emotional bandwidth left each day to care about other people's hurts and struggles. It goes without saying, we're not the only one that faces difficulties, disappointments, even heartbreaking situations. Everyone does. Shakespeare said that into every life a little rain must fall. And indeed, sometimes it's a downpour. It's a deluge. But caring about other people rather than just caring about ourselves is one secret to becoming sympathetic, compassionate, and that's attractive to other people. Self-focus is emotionally exhausting for most of us to be around, and self-focused individuals and their attitude, well, it needs to be replaced with a spirit of caring about the needs of others more than my own needs, and how can I unselfishly give and bless them? Well, there's a fifth attitude that can be self-defeating, a terrible mistake we can make, and that is constantly comparing myself in a negative or envious fashion to others. I've said in this broadcast so many times, quoting someone else, I don't know who originally said it, comparison is the thief of joy. When we start comparing our situation, our marital status, our economic well-being to other people, we can quickly begin to feel very badly about ourselves and even become very bitter. Well, constantly comparing ourselves to someone else is a huge mistake. Someone who's doing that, when we compare ourselves to others who seem to have more gifts, more opportunities, better good looks, it sends the message, I don't have much to offer and I wish I were someone else other than who I am. And no one's going to be attracted to someone who says, I really don't have anything to offer and I wish I was someone else. I'm so unhappy with who I am. The antidote to such envy and even jealousy is to believe and even rejoice that God made you just as you are so that you could fulfill His special plan for you. Can I say that again? God made you the way you are, not accidentally or randomly. He made you the way you are so that the way He made you could fit exactly with the plans that He has for you. How He made me, how He made you, is not at odds with His will for our life or His vision. In fact, it fits hand in glove. As someone once wisely said, be yourself, everyone else is already taken. Be yourself. Thank God for who you are, not in a vain or proud way, of course, but rejoice in who you are and the unique plan He has for your life. Others will be drawn to that because that's a rare attitude in our world and culture. The sixth mistake singles can make is perfectionism. This attitude says, I have a long list of criteria or standards another person, potential mate, must meet, and they must be a perfect 10 or thereabouts. Otherwise, I'm not interested. Well, what this person is forgetting is that they are not likely a 10 themselves. Most of us aren't a 10, and so to demand that we have a 10 is rather presumptuous and gratuitous if you stop and think about it. They are far from perfect themselves in a host of areas. So they need to let go of external measures of another person's attractiveness or value and focus more. It's nothing wrong with wanting an attractive spouse, but we need to focus on inward traits such as kindness, a caring heart, sympathetic concern for others, a life of integrity, honesty, and a deep spirituality and walk with God. You see, those are things that time and age and illness and sickness cannot take from you. I would say there are some elderly people women that are still attractive, or men that may be handsome, but for the most part, age tends to erase those natural gifts of youth. And what you have instead is a body that is aging, and maybe hair that has fallen out, and eyes that droop, and things that just aren't what they once were. Well, listen, if you marry just for looks, as time goes on, your love is going to fade. But if you marry for character and values, if you marry for spirituality, that can only get better as time goes on. Reminds me of the joke. A mother once gave her daughter this advice: marry an archaeologist, because the older you get, the more interested he'll become in you. Well, actually, you don't have to marry an archaeologist. Marry a person just of deep integrity and godly values. You won't be disappointed. Finally, the last mistake they often make is fear. Underneath all their complaints about how few good women or men there are to date or marry, they need to realize their fear of commitment, their fear of vulnerability, and perhaps even rejection is leading them to sabotage every viable potential mate that comes along. Now, that doesn't happen to everyone, but according to one study, about 25% of singles do that. That fear leads them to avoidance, and avoidance leads them to sabotage the relationship before it gets very far at all. They need to face the fact that they are afraid of intimacy and identify the hurts and the wounds that cause them to retreat in the face of love and vulnerability, and learn this life-giving and liberating truth: there is no genuine love without risk. You can never enjoy genuine love without risking something yourself. The old adage, "I have met the enemy and it is me," may have some important wisdom for singles who find themselves frustrated year after year with no seeming progress in their life toward finding a husband or wife. Now, let me also hasten to say, and this is an important qualification, it may be that it is not God's timing for you to meet the right person yet. It just may be. And there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, it may be a vital part of walking and living by faith. At the same time, it's worth having close friends, a counselor, a pastor who knows you, who cares about you, will help you look at these 7 mistakes singles make, and lovingly and honestly help you recognize which ones you might be making. Proverbs 27:6 finishes this teaching with an important note. Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. What does that mean? A single may need someone who knows and loves and cares about them to carefully and tenderly, compassionately point out the mistakes they believe they're making. Not because they enjoy being critical or they have some self-righteous attitude, but they want to see their friend actually find that person, that man or woman that they're longing to find. Well, let's look at some questions regarding these 7 mistakes. And these are drawn from situations that I have encountered in our years of ministry, that I've read about, situations that I'm aware of sometimes through other people or other pastoral friends. I put these in the form of questions because I think that's the easiest way to understand the problem and look at the solution. My boyfriend has an anger problem, but he won't acknowledge it. He doesn't realize it. If he gets upset about something, though, his whole demeanor changes. He starts using harsh language. His face sometimes turns a different color or shade, and he seems to lose all the fruit of the Spirit for at least that moment. Well, eventually he calms down and goes back to being a relaxed and somewhat easygoing person. I have to admit I'm careful with what topics I bring up so as not to set him off or trigger him. How can I tell him his anger scares me at times without him getting angry at me? Well, angry people who refuse to recognize their anger problem likely will get angry if you address it. And that's one of the risks you take in being the kind of friend that Proverbs was speaking about. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but only an enemy multiplies kisses. If you're at this point already put off by his anger or somewhat intimidated or even frightened by it, that's a real good sign this is not a relationship to pursue at this point. That anger rarely goes away all on itself, and the likelihood it could increase in scope and take forms that you never imagined in your marriage should be enough to warn you that for right now, this anger is not something that you need to involve yourself with. You can lovingly tell him your feelings, but it's for someone else to sort that out rather than you. I'm interested in a girl that comes from a conflicted home. Her parents are still married, but they have argued and fought during most of her growing up years. I'd like to date her, but she can say mean things without any warning. And she can treat me and others poorly whenever she's hurt or upset about something. Now, she's pretty, she's intelligent, she's a believer, but sometimes she's mean. Am I right just to move on? Well, like anger, that's a problem you're going to have to address. That meanness is hurtful. It is harmful. It can be soul-crushing in a relationship or a marriage. I witnessed once two singles where she was supposed to pick him up at the airport from a business trip, and she was somehow late or not there. Something went wrong with their plan, and he just dressed her down for it. He stood with his hands on his hips in a very condescending way, demanding, like of a father speaking to a little child who spilled milk or something. Why did you do that? Why didn't you do this right? I mean, he was just mean. And when people have that kind of attitude where they treat others poorly, and if they're hurt, they hurt others, you don't want to live with that either. That's not going to make for a joyful home, one that you look forward to. And again, he needs to be confronted about, or she in this case, needs to be confronted with her meanness. Mean girls usually end up being lonely girls. I have a roommate who constantly says there are just no good men left out there. She blames her lack of dates on the poor condition of the church and culture, the immaturity of men her age. Yet at the same time, she's always complaining about her unfair treatment at work, that her parents didn't really show her love growing up, and how her sister got all the breaks in life, but she did not. Frankly, I'm tired of her poor me attitude. I find reasons not to be around her, just so I don't have to listen to her long list of complaints. And I believe, again, that complaining is really off-putting. Complaining you can tolerate occasionally, but to hear it all the time, men particularly are going to run from a complaining woman. There's something I just think in the male soul that does not enjoy hearing complaints. Indeed, often men, they feel their strengths is to be willing to bear up, carry on when there's reason to complain. My son, who was an Army officer, said the number one rule among officers was to never complain in the presence of the men that they commanded, indeed not to complain at all. If it was raining, if their food was cold, if it was a 20-yard or 20-mile march, the one thing you never did was complain, because it's like a cancer. that spreads through the ranks. It destroys morale, and pretty soon no one can really be as effective as they could be. The same is true in relationships. That's what complaining can do. My cousin has been divorced 3 times. With each divorce, I watched her become progressively a more bitter person. She and her sister had an argument, and now they have not spoken for several years. When she's invited to family events, she won't come because she's angry with one or more of her relatives. She's bitter at her ex-husband, bitter toward some of her siblings, and most of all, she's bitter toward God. Yet she says she desperately wants to get married again and wants to know if we know anyone that might be interested. Well, you can see the problem here as well. Bitterness toward other people is one of those attitudes that's just so toxic. Bitterness, if it's directed toward one person, it only takes a slight shift of the weather vane before it's directed at you. Bitterness is a spiritual problem. We are to get rid of, Ephesians 4, all bitterness, rage, slander, along with every form of malice. If you know you're single and you know you have a problem forgiving others and you know that you carry bitterness, let me just encourage you to surrender that to Christ today, to ask forgiveness and to release people from the wrongs. It doesn't mean they're off God's hook just because they're off yours. But if you want to attract people, there's hardly anything sweeter than a forgiving spirit, a gracious spirit, even one that's willing to overlook other people's wrongs. It says in the book of Proverbs, it's the glory of man to overlook an offense. Well, I've been dating a man who is so into himself. He spends a huge amount of time and money picking out the right clothes, right athletic gear, getting the latest sunglasses. I recently went through a surgery. We had been dating, and he never came to see me in the hospital because he was running in a marathon that weekend. He says he loves me and talks about marriage, but my friends say, be careful. You'll be marrying a Ken doll who thinks only of himself. Well, again, sympathy, compassion, caring about others, putting our desires or our plans aside when someone else needs us, that's a very attractive trait. And that many singles don't understand that simply focusing on themselves is never going to really attract a long list of potentials, because people will quickly realize you're really into you. And that means you probably couldn't be all that interested in me or care for me. So this self-focus is really something that is a huge barrier to building relationships. I grew up in the shadow of an older brother who seemed to excel at everything. He hit the game-winning home run on his baseball team for the state championship in high school. He received an appointment to the academy after graduation. He always could have his choice of girls at school longing to go out with him. Well, in my adult years, my dad was proud of him, but he never told me the same, never said he was proud of me. So in my adult years, I've struggled with drugs and alcohol because I feel I just don't measure up. How can I get over this idea I'll always be the loser in comparison to my brother or others? Well, the mistake you're making, my friend, is to compare yourself to others, because God does not. Can I say that again? God does not compare us to others, because God has a plan for us that's unique, that's singular, that's designed. Ephesians tells us that God prepared in advance good works for us to do. In other words, God has a beautiful plan for your life that your brother can't fulfill and your best friend cannot fulfill, or the most gifted person you know cannot fulfill, because it's not designed for them. It's designed for you. And so you need to give up this idea that you need to be as handsome or gifted or intelligent or wealthy or whatever as someone else in order to attract a spouse. No, God has somebody out there that will love you just for you. You may not have found them yet, but they're there. I attend a large church. It recently had a large event for singles. It brought together the 30 and under singles group and the 40 and over singles group. Sadly, the MC for the evening had to interrupt the event to tell some of the older, it was only a few, but to tell a few of those older single men not to try and hit on the under 30 crowd. Well, I was embarrassed for them. Couldn't they see how creepy they were behaving? No, I don't think they understood how creepy it was, that they were trying to find somebody in 20, 30 years younger than themselves, particularly when that group wasn't designed for them to begin with. To tell you the truth, I really think you should seek somebody pretty much your old age. Well, as you get older, you can do 10 years one way or the other maybe. But you need someone who has your maturity, experience, physical well-being. You don't want to be living in different life stages as you go along. Well, maybe one more question quickly. One of my friends is a man I'll call Dave. His father was a highly successful businessman, made his millions. Dave is now in his 40s, has a drinking problem that he doesn't admit to. Furthermore, he's been engaged 3 times and has broken each one off himself. At first, he blamed each fiancé for the breakup, but after the 3rd time, I'm not buying it anymore. What is his problem besides drinking? Well, I would say his problem probably lies in the area of what I mentioned earlier, avoidance, fear of intimacy, fear of commitment, fear of vulnerability. The easiest thing to do is just to decide, hey, there's something so wrong with this person, I can't go through with the marriage. And that's really sad because he's going to end up alone when he could have perhaps known a very satisfying and fulfilling married life. Not every single needs to get married, nor should. I've said that over and over again. Jesus and Paul were single, the most influential men of all time. Well, I hope this has been helpful and that you'll join us for our next episode and broadcast. Thank you so much for joining us as we discuss relationship problems from a biblical perspective. Remember, marriage is for better, for worse, and for keeps.